psychedelics were blocked with marijuana. And now, this, as I said, is NAPS's 26th year. So you really need to think long term. This could be generations more. You always have to be aware of a backlash. So when you think about careers of social change, and many of you may focus on drug policy, or I heard about the anti-oppression workshop that was this morning, how there may be many, it sounded great. Are there may be other areas that you want to work on? And so, now come these brief lessons from my drug trips. So, the first one is something that you hear all the time, that obviously you have to find something that you're passionate about, and that you have a vision for your life of how it fits in with you to work on. And that may take a while for you to filter this, but it's really, really important to find your passion. And for me, I had one incident, I'll start out with LSD. So when I turned 21, I was living in Sarasota, Florida. My girlfriend at the time was in England studying pottery, so I was all by myself. And so I decided I would take LSD by myself. I lived at a house end of the dead end street. And I put on a bunch of music, and I was just sort of listening to it. And you know how with LSD that you get very absorbed sometimes in what you're doing. Yeah. So I just got very absorbed, and then out of somehow or other I started hearing this area siren. And my first thought was, shit, I'm just turning 21, and now I'm going to die. We live near Tampa, which is the major Air Force base where there's American bombers, nuclear weapons. I thought, the bomb's going to be dropping, and this is the end of my life. And what am I going to do in the last few minutes? And I remembered a Grateful Dead song where, it was about, I don't know, I can call it the heat of the sun, man died of cold, about how your mind can kind of overcome things. So I didn't think necessarily. So I decided that I would just walk towards the bottom, and I would live as much as I could in these last few minutes of my life. And so I walked out the door, and I'm walking down, the lane, and I'm like to the street, and I'm just noticing the incredible beauty of all the different shades of green, of all the plants, and all the shades of blue and white and clouds in the sky, and all the sounds of the birds and the squirrels. And I can remember to this day how much information there was, and like how I felt now hyper alive and hyper vigilant, and just absorbing stuff that I mostly would take for granted. And then all of a sudden, the air raid siren stopped, and the drums started, and the guitar started, and I realized it was a record that I had put on. Again, my first thought is, how stupid can you be? But then what happened was that I wasn't able to sustain that level of being at that edge of life and death. And that left imprinted me that psychedelics under certain circumstances can really help you feel more alive than you've ever felt before. And that's something. That's something worthy of a life effort to bring into our society, to bring up from the underground. So that helps solidify, for me, the passion to work on psychedelics. Now, because this is long-term, the next story comes from a 2CB experience. And so, what it's really important when you're working in an area that has minimal support to begin with, it's a socially marginalized cause that isn't the dominant paradigm, that you're going to have to struggle for a very long time, and many of your objectives you're not going to be able to obtain. And so, if you end up having your goal, if you define success as, let's say, marijuana legalization, if you pick your mission as SSDP, it's going to be marijuana legalization. And if that's how you define success, all your efforts up to that, in a sense, are not gratifying, because it's only if you succeed. You're looking at your outcome, you're not looking at your process. And so it's very important to redefine success into something that you control, because we don't control the outcome. That's something that hundreds of millions of people are collectively going to decide. But you yourself can influence what you spend your time on, and whether you spend it productively, or whether you try your hardest, or just do a half-assed job. So that if you focus on the process, you can get satisfaction and joy, even if the outcome is left for the next generation, or you won't see it yourself. And so where I saw that was, one night I took 2CB at a party at college, danced all night, And then I had just an enormous amount of energy. This was a time where I was able to make it to the 5 a.m. Jacuzzi. So around the sunrise, I went swimming in the pool. And it was locked, I had to climb over. I was the only one there, so we make it in this pool. And normally, I would swim a mile for exercise. And so when I started swimming, I was thinking, I should count the laps, I should make it to a mile. And then somehow I just felt like, when I do that, it's like, again, if you don't make the whole distance, it's a failure. And so instead of swimming towards a certain number of laps, if I just shifted and I swam towards exhaustion, if just being exhausted then became my goal, then every stroke that I took was a success, because I was getting closer and closer to getting exhausted. And it didn't really matter. And I had such a feeling of liberation and joy that I swam way more than a mile. But it was that sense of focusing on the process. And I had the same thing. I ran the New York Marathon. And I ducked into one of the portable bathrooms right before the start line and smoked a joint. And because of the work that I was doing with maps, I didn't have enough time to practice, to really run enough practice laps. And so I wasn't sure I was going to make it. And again, I was talking to my wife on the phone, and I had this idea that unless I succeed this marathon, I'm a failure. And somehow I figured out right beforehand, just minutes before the starting line, that I was trying. That the most important thing was that this was a goal that I was trying for. And whether I made it or not didn't really matter as long as I tried hard as I could. And then every single step was a success, rather than only a success if I made it. And so again, because of that, that freed me up so much. So I was able to go ahead and make it. And it's that attitude of focusing on the process. Now, when you just focus on the process, not the outcome though, you also run the danger of not critically thinking about what you're doing. You're just trying hard, because outcomes are really important as measurements of how well. So that if you can separate the self-hatred from the self-criticism, then you can have this engine of quality control, even as you're focusing on the process. And so for me, that really came to be an eye-beginning experience that I had. And so when I first did the DEA, was back in 1984, trying to block the criminalization of MDMA. And there's a fellow named Leosef, the secret chief, was the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement. He's the one that really introduced MDMA into the community of therapists. And he came to me and he said that one of the problems of the 60s was that a lot of the people who were leading it felt like, they're enlightened, they have these psychedelic drugs, they're better than everybody, and they were blind to their own flaws. And that's in part why we had the arrogance and the crackdown. So what he said was, I really need to give you a training session with Ibogaine. That'll shake you up and that'll help you to be a little bit more mature. So he gave me a combination LSD Ibogaine session. And during it, I spent 12 hours vomiting. And it was about this whole sense of, I felt, as a Jewish person though, the imagery for me was, I was crucified on the cross of my own self-perfectionism. And every time that I saw that, I would just throw up. And then I would feel fine for a little bit, and then the nausea would come. And so I spent 12 hours like that, and then it was transcendence through exhaustion. It wasn't that I figured it out, but I just got so tired of beating myself up that I was able to kind of learn the destructive nature of sort of the self-hatred link, but how crucial it is that we have access to the self-criticism. So I think that's something for all of you to consider. We want to know always how we can be doing better, and our own deep inner minds will tell us if we're open to that. And the Ibogaine was in 1985, and I still think about it today as something that influences me, and I think that's one of the critical conditions that has set up MAPS for the successes that we've been able to achieve. Now, another part of this is accepting your own shadow and not demonizing your opponent. Okay, because that's one of the big things, is that if you think that you're self-righteous, that we've got, and we do have the right cause, but if you demonize the opponent, then you're going to make it harder for them to listen. And so I was, one time did DMT with Terrence McKenna and others from my first experience. I have this the first thing was this sort of line, this horizontal line, and then the second thing was this vertical line. And then the third thing was it started turning into cubes, and then it had this red color. And then it turned into cubes building like an M.C. Escher painting that was just totally, didn't make sense. And then I was caught. And that whole thing took just seconds. And then I was like in this space where I just felt like everything in my head was put there by somebody else. Every single word, practically. Somebody else developed the word, the concepts, how much we are a product of the past, and how rare it is that we think even an original thought. And I thought about a whole sweep of history that had been so beautiful and all the progress that had been made to bring us to this point that I would have all of these thoughts, and how this was moving towards ever greater openness and freedom and human rights, and how this was sort of, I was a part of all this beautiful sweep. And then I had this shocking kind of realization that I was appropriating all the good parts of history, but not the bad parts. And if I was intellectually honest, that meant that I also had an inner Hitler. And for someone who was Jewish and traumatized by the Holocaust, for me to acknowledge that I had this inner Hitler, that I want to control things, I want things my way, it was a massive bummer. And it sort of took me right down, and it took me for like a day. So accepting, though, the fact that we have our own flaws, and that we're more in common with our enemies than we may think. And we have to sympathize with them as well. So that this DMT experience really opened me up to a sort of humility about what it is that we all contain, and that we have to acknowledge that. So then the next day, with this group of therapists, we did ketamine. And so the idea here is that not only do you not demonize your opponent, but you need to understand what motivates them, and even sympathize. So in the ketamine experience, I had this sense that I was hovering above and behind Hitler as he was giving this speech in an enormous stadium to, hundreds of thousands of people. And I felt like I was protected above and behind him. And my mission was, on the one hand, to try to figure out what he was getting out of this. What do megalomaniacs, what do psychopaths, what do they get out of it? How could I reach him? And so I had this rising panic. At the same time, I somehow connected to the fact that I could breathe. And that if I would keep breathing deeply, I could keep looking, and I would overcome the panic, and I would understand. And what I saw was this Heil Hitler salute that everybody then would do back to him. It was like a ball of energy, and he would push it out. So it's like the one to the many. He would push it out, and they would all do this Heil Hitler salute, and all get concentrated back on him. And then it would go back and forth like that, multiple times, getting bigger and bigger and bigger about this whole collective putting all their energy into this one meter. And so it was something that helped me a little bit to try to understand. It was thoughts that I hadn't had before. And it was trying to really get into the mind of the other. And one of the key things that the training that I had at the Kennedy School was to think of ourselves as the aid to the politician that you're trying to influence. And then you're writing a policy memo for them. And you're trying to explain as unbiased and accurate as you can why they should come to a certain decision. So I think when you think about the DEA, when you think about other people, it's really important, the people that you're arguing with, to really try to get into their heads and speak in their language. That's what we're doing with the FDA, try to speak in the language of the FDA. Now, at the same time that you're doing all this, we're working on unpopular conditions. This is my last drug story. And fitting that it ends up with an MDMA story. So, what I was wanting to leave you with is that in a lot of our work, you'll be working alone or working with a few people. You'll be working against enormous opposition. Many people will not appreciate what you're doing. I mean, we can, of course, stay within our own little groups and talk to ourselves, but real social change is when we move out and speak to the people on the other side. So one of the things that really helps is that in these moments when you're alone, or these moments when you're feeling repressed, is to understand that there's this web of connection and love that binds us all, and that you can draw great strength from that. And so one time I was camping out in Big Sur on the ocean, and this was involving our DEA lawsuit. So I was involved with trying to think about the DEA looking at me. And I was also at this sad period of time without a girlfriend. And I was working with Brother David Spiegelrost, who was a Roman Catholic monk who was trying MDMA in the monastery as an aid to meditation, and reporting to the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, who I was also working with, about the spiritual use of psychedelics. And so I was trying to imagine what it's like to be a celibate monk. Why would they want, what's the advantage? Why would they want to do it? And also try to understand, the DEA looking back at me. And so at some point now, if you can imagine, the mountains right behind me, camping out, there's this enormous Pacific Ocean roaring, and the high tide went like 3 feet from where I was camping out, but it wouldn't get me wet. So I was in this protected spot, but in the middle of this incredible universe with, the enormous night sky. And I felt like I would just fly apart, and that there was nothing holding me there. And that was really kind of scary. And then I realized, though, that for some reason, I wasn't flying apart. I was staying there, and that there was something holding me, and that was gravity. And then I imagined somehow that gravity was like the arms of a woman, and that I was sleeping in the arms of gravity. And there was this web of universal love built into the universe that was supporting me. And ever since then, I've never felt lonely in that same way when I was by myself. And I understood that is what the monastic life is supposed to help you to get to. Beyond thinking of loving with an individual and trying to get to this universal love. So I think if you can keep that in mind at the difficult moments of your struggle, that will help a lot. And so those are some of the lessons for how to build a career in social change that won't end up in you being burnt out or you being bitter or cynical. It's a way to keep moving. And so there's one quote that I'll end with, and this is by Reverend Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman was a black minister. Oh, wow. All right, okay, yes, yeah. Okay, so Howard Thurman was Martin Luther King's mentor. Martin Luther King got a PhD at Boston University, and Reverend Howard Thurman was his mentor. In 1962, Howard Thurman was the minister who let Tim Leary bring 20 divinity students into his chapel on Good Friday for the Good Friday experiment, where half of them got psilocybin mushrooms in church, and the other got a placebo. And the purpose of the study was to see if psilocybin could facilitate a mystical experience. And so Howard Thurman was just a very open-minded man. This was before psychedelics were all that controversial. 1962, I did my undergraduate thesis on a follow-up, tracking these people down after 25 years and seeing what they said. And they validated the fact, the people that were in the study, that their experience with psilocybin seemed genuine to them, even after they compared it to non-drug mystical experiences, and the sense of unity and connection motivated them to work on social change, because they identified with people. They didn't see differences as a reason to be scared. They saw the commonalities as a reason to appreciate the differences. So here's what Howard Thurman says. Don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and go do that. Because what the world needs is more people who come alive. And that's
Thank you, Rick. That was absolutely amazing. And we know that you couldn't be here with us last night for the awards ceremony, so we thought we would take this opportunity to recognize. Hey, it's serious. Because of your leadership and your wisdom and everything that you've shared with SSDP and everything that you have helped us do and helped our students learn and helped them experience. You've also been an incredible help to us this year by loaning SSDP a bunch of money that we needed, and we paid them back, and it was very nice, and we very much appreciate it. And so without further ado, Rick Doblin, we'd like to give you the Stuart Abelson Goodwill Award. Oh.
office where it has my diploma from my PhD from Harvard, And I also have two other things. Now I'm going to add this to it. The one other thing is my children's DARE graduation certificate. I recently spoke at the graduation in Amsterdam, and so I gave an honorary degree certificate from Amsterdam, and now I'll put my SSDP thing right there as well.
Mm-hmm.